Hello, dear friends. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on when you're watching us. Have a good rest of your day. I'm Daniel Kamroff. Welcome to my podcast on YouTube. Today we meet with Rabbi David Fox Sandmel. He is a president of the International Council of Christians and Jews. He's an immediate past chair of the International Jewish Committee for Interreligious Consultations. From 2014 to 2022, he was the director of interreligious engagement at ADL. He held the Crown Ryan Chair of Jewish Studies at the Catholic Theological Union in Chicago and was Jewish scholar at the Institute for Christian and Jewish Studies in Baltimore, where he directed the publication of Dabru Emet, a Jewish statement on Christians and Christianity. Dear David, thank you for the privilege to learn from you.
Well, thank you. It's great to talk to you.
Thank you so much. Um, I wanted to start this interview with a sad Jewish joke. So it happened somewhere in Eastern Europe. A pogrom swept through a small town at night. The next morning, Feder was walking past a hardware store, on the doors of which the pogromists had crucified his neighbor, Chaim. He saw the half-dead Chaim and asked, Chaim, are you in pain? No, Chaim answered with difficulty. Only when I laugh. This story is about difficult relationship with neighbors, about the long history of anti-Jewish rhetoric and violence, pogroms, expulsions, about World War II, when the Nazis killed two-thirds of European Jews. I'd like to ask about your father, the late Rabbi Samuel Sandmel, a pioneer in Jewish Christian studies, distinguished scholar, and one of the most significant interpreters of Christianity to Jews and Judaism to Christians. How did your father, knowing this complex history so well, come to the idea of the need for interreligious dialogue?
Well, let me start with his father, who left Tsarist Russia, actually from Zhytomyr, which is, I think, today in the Ukraine. But he left there, at least according to family lore, because he saw a flyer announcing a plan for a pogrom on his community. And he fled. Came to the United States, eventually was able to bring his family over. My father was born in America, but he had older siblings born I guess it's appropriate to call it Russia at that point in time. I don't want to offend anybody. Um, and My father was brought up in the United States, went to public schools. He used to talk about his that he and his Jewish friends would walk home taking a long route so that they didn't go by the local Catholic school because the kids would throw rocks at them and, beat them up and stuff. Um, he he went to public university in Missouri and then to Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, where he was ordained as a rabbi. And his well, I won't give you his whole story, but his second position was at the Hill as the Hillel director at the University of North Carolina. And he came in, he had a background in ancient languages, and he started studying at Duke University with a Methodist scholar named Harvey Branscombe III. And Harvey told my father, with your languages, Latin and Greek, in addition, of course, to Hebrew and Aramaic and so forth, you should really study early Christ Judaism and early Christianity. And at that point in time, that was quite a new field. We're talking maybe 1940, um, maybe a dozen years after Joseph Klausner's Jesus of Nazareth was translated into English. And that started him in that direction. Um, But then he served as a chaplain in the Second World War. He was in the Navy, but he was with the Marine Third Division in the Pacific. They were at some epic battles at Saipan and Okinawa. Um, uh, and my father never talked about it. Apparently, he saw some horrendous things. But as part of that chaplain experience, he worked very closely with Christian chaplains. And that was also part of the mix. And when he finished uh, when the war was over, he ended up doing his doctoral work at Yale with Erwin Goodenough, who was a scholar of diaspora Judaism. Wrote extensively, for example, on the murals at the Dura Europos synagogue and so forth. And so. Um, uh, he came out of this PhD program uh, with a deep understanding of both Judaism and Christianity. At that point, Harvey Branscombe was then the president of Vanderbilt University and hired my father for his first position as a professor of Jewish studies at Vanderbilt, which again in the late 40s, early 50s was quite something. And so with that background, a few years later, he was then brought to the Hebrew Union College, where he stayed for most of his career. But he was already sort of off and running in that direction. And the in the United States, at least, the Protestant world was very receptive at that point in time. Again, this is the post-war era. The Catholic world, not so much. Excuse me, the Catholic world, not so much until 1965, when Nostra Aetate was promulgated. And at that point, um, the Catholic world sort of opened up. Again, in the United States, at least, the Catholic world was sort of waiting for this. But they needed sort of the go-ahead from Rome. But I think he looked at his experience as a child, as the child of immigrants, as a product of American public education, as someone who served in the armed forces, working with Christians, and then the aftermath of the Second World War and the Shoah. And I think it was almost a natural, in a sense, for him to take this on. So, and it really became a focal point of his career.
This is really interesting because you mentioned that when he was in school, he had bad instances where he had bad experiences with Christian kids. So it's very interesting because after those experiences, you would assume that someone would back away from trying to understand other people, but that wasn't exactly the case, as I understand.
Well, first of all, that wasn't his personality. But he also had these very powerful, positive experiences with Christian scholars and clergy and leaders. Um, so he had something to balance out those early negative experiences.
Definitely. Um, I wanted to say that not every Jew, not every rabbi will agree to engage with in the dialogue with the other. It can be
Mhm.
said that you continued your father's work by participating, developing dialogue, and positive relations with other religions. Please tell us about the activities of the organizations to which you are directly related and which develop a culture of bridges between representatives of different nationalities and religions.
Well, let me first say that I grew up in that environment and I sort of went into the family business, as it were. But at our home, for Shabbat dinner or Pesach Sidarim and so forth, there were always Christians, ministers, pastors, priests, nuns. That was just part of what we did. Um, and in addition to the work that my father did, my mother was also involved. She actually wrote a novel for young children with a theme of Jewish-Christian relations in it. And she was invited to a convent in our neighborhood for several years to do a model Seder, and she would take me along as a little boy because someone had to do the four questions, right? And so it was really part of the world in which I grew up. So um, uh, uh, I guess it was a kind of a natural. So um, uh, I did my undergraduate work in Jewish studies, though interestingly enough, one of the most important classes that I took there was a course called Jews in the Orbit of Islam, um, taught by Professor Robert Chazen. And I was aware of Jewish-Christian relations, but this really opened up for me the world of Jewish-Muslim relations. Um, I um, After I finished my doctorate, and for my doctorate, I wrote about a scholar named Joseph Klausner, who wrote. I think I mentioned his book actually. He wrote a number of books on early Judaism and early Christianity, and was on the first faculty of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. Um, but I went to work after I finished my doctorate at the Institute for Christian and Jewish Studies in Baltimore. And you mentioned this as well, where I was involved in the publication of Dabru Emet, which was really the first public Jewish statement on Jewish-Christian relations, endorsed by a broad spectrum of Jewish leadership um, since Nostra Aetate. So I was involved in that and worked at that organization for a few years. I then was on the faculty of a Roman Catholic seminary in Chicago, actually the same seminary where now Pope Leo studied, although we were not there at the same time. So I never met him, though some of my colleagues taught him. Um, and Teaching in a Catholic seminary, especially a seminary like the Catholic Theological Union, which was very deeply rooted in the Second Vatican Council, but also had a significant proportion of international students. So I got to meet uh, Catholics from all over the world. In some instances, I was the first Jew they'd ever met and the first time they'd been exposed to any of this work. But I love teaching at CTU. I then worked, as you mentioned, at the Anti-Defamation League as their director of interreligious engagement, and that put me in a somewhat different environment, sort of a little bit more institutional. Um, and working with leaders in sort of comparable organizations in the Jewish and in the Christian and in the Muslim world. Um, there is some interaction with other religious traditions, but not as much. I've concentrated primarily on Jewish Christian, but also on Jewish Muslim, and then a little bit on other traditions. Um, and At that same time, I was uh, a member of the board of the International Jewish Committee for Interreligious Consultations, or IJKIC, an unfortunate name, which is a consortium of Jewish organizations that um, represents, or at least tries to represent, the Jewish people as if anybody can, to organizations like the Vatican, the World Council of Churches, the Ecumenical Patriarchate of the Orthodox Churches, World Evangelical Alliance, and so forth. And I eventually served as chair of that organization. Um, and had the opportunity to meet with significant religious leaders from other traditions. Um, I met Pope Francis several times, though in all honesty, I can't say that I sat down and talked with him at great length. These were more formal organizations, but formal opportunities. And now I am the president of the board of the International Council of Christians and Jews, which was founded shortly after the Second World War, following the famous Seelisberg Conference of 1947, at which Jules Isaac played a primary role in presenting his theses about the teaching of contempt. Um, that conference produced what is known as the 12 Points of Seelisberg, which are really sort of the foundational document for post-World War II Jewish-Christian relations, but also I think really set the stage for interreligious relations writ large. And the ICCJ is best based in Heppenheim, Germany, in a house where Martin Buber used to live, which is a lot of fun. And we have about 34 member organizations around the world. And we try to promote not only Jewish-Christian relations, but we also sponsor something called the International Abrahamic Forum, which is in its early stages right now, but focuses on trilateral dialogue. So that's probably a longer answer than you had hoped I would give, but that's briefly sort of what my involvement has been.
That
And
is a great answer. And I wanted to talk about the Second Vatican Council because you said that it influenced a lot of organizations. And I wanted to talk about actually this October is the 60th anniversary of the adoption of the by the Catholic Church of the Second Vatican Council of the Nostra Aetate. How many spiritual leaders in the Jewish and Catholic communities do you think know about this declaration and tell their congregants about it?
um, well, what you've put your finger on what is one of the primary challenges. Um, I would uh, and for an organization like the Catholic Church that has 1.2, 1.4 billion members around the world, one of the challenges with anything is how do you get a message from Rome out to the local parish, wherever it might be in the United States, in South America, in Eastern Europe, wherever, and this is a challenge. Um, and one of the things about Jewish Catholic relations is that um, they're perceived as most relevant in places where there are Jewish communities. So, um, uh, if you are a Catholic priest in New York City, where there are lots of Jews, it's going to have more relevance than, again, other parts of the world where there aren't Jews. I think particularly about parts of Asia and parts of Africa, for example, where the Catholic Church is growing, but where there simply aren't Jews. So if you are a uh, seminary rector in one of these parts of the world, and um, how do you see that that gets on the curriculum of your seminary when the people in the Bible department want another required course, and the professors in the homiletics, want another course? How do you get that in there? How does that get to the top of the um, to the top of the priority list. That's one of the things that we talk about a lot when we meet with our colleagues at the Vatican. This 60th anniversary, I hope, will be an opportunity to highlight this, but this is a challenge. In the Jewish community, um, I think that there probably percentage wise, there's probably more knowledge of this because it's that much more relevant, right? And also, we've seen, starting with Dabru Emet, but now also with the gift with between Rome and Jerusalem, and some other statements that have come out with from not only from the progressive Jewish community, but also from representatives of the Orthodox community. I think there is a raised awareness of this, but there's still a lot more to do. And there's a lot of anti-Jewish bias in the Christian world, and there's a lot of anti-Christian bias in the Jewish world.
Definitely. And it's, I would say it's understandable that it is relevant for Jews because it's hard to find a place in the world where there are Jews and there are no Catholic Christians. So
Hmm.
that's true. Um, in preparations for my interviews for my YouTube channel for the rubric of keeping the faith, I was blessed to virtually meet and learn from outstanding scholars, rabbis, and also from an Archbishop of the Roman Catholic Church, Tadeusz Kondrusiewicz, Dr. Malhassan Glashvili, Bishop of the Evangelical Christian Baptist Church, and Imam Abdullah Antepli. All of these interviews are can be viewed on my channel. Uh, in conversation with the Imam, I learned that the Prophet Muhammad had wonderful relationships with many Jews. His two wives were Jewish, and he attended Shabbat services and ate kosher food. Are there Muslims in America? Are Muslims in America an active part of the interfaith communication?
Um, well, that's a complicated question, especially at this moment in time. Abdullah Tepli is a friend of mine, and he and I think many others are committed to preserving and maintaining Jewish-Muslim dialogue. The obvious challenge has been the ongoing hostilities between Israel and Hamas, and between Israel and other neighbors that have certainly strained relationships. There are places where Jewish-Muslim dialogue simply collapsed. Were unable to continue. But there are other examples and other individuals who um, continue to maintain and work on intercommunal relations. And I think that um, um, uh, Jews and many Jews and Muslims recognize that, or at least American Jews and Muslims recognize that that common American identity um, is important at a time when minorities in the United States are being targeted, being threatened, when the ability to say, I'm very concerned about what's going on in Israel and Gaza, but I'm also concerned about what's going on in my neighborhood. We need to stay in relationship because we have common interests here. Um, so I have colleagues with whom I am in touch, and uh, uh, it's difficult again because of the political situation, but I think it's a necessity. And this is a very concerning time in the United States, and um, I think that people who understand that need to work together.
Is there any modern document, declaration of Jewish organizations, say in the United States, about their attitude towards other religions, principles, approaches to interreligious dialogue?
Um, well, I'm not specifically aware of, um, I mean, a something that addresses interreligious dialogue on a large basis, though. I mean, uh, there continues to be development in the Jewish Christian world. So, well, it's not that new, I guess, but 10 years ago, the Vatican put out something called The Gifts and Calling of God Are Irrevocable, which was again, on the 50th anniversary of Nostra Aetate. But Nostra Aetate, um, if you look at it today, um, uh, it seems fairly timid in a certain way. It's very brief. There are a lot of things that it does not address. It leaves a lot of questions open. And, again, it emerged in a particular historical and political moment, both within the broader world and within the church itself. Um, and while it was groundbreaking in its day, we're now 60 years later, and there's been a lot that's happened. So, for example, this document, "The Gifts and Calling," um, addresses um, um, some of the things that were left unsaid in Nostra Aetate. Though, I mean, again, if you take a look at the church, there's been a whole um, um, there's been a development there's been a series of documents. Um, there's notes on Nostra Aetate, and there have been things in other Vatican documents as well. So you see this progression, and you can see some of this in the Protestant world as well. The Anglican Communion has produced some documents. The Lutheran World Federation, just in the last 5 years, I think, just put out a new document on Jewish Lutheran relations. So um, uh, I don't think I answered your question directly, but uh,
Well,
um,
it's still developments. It's still something that we're doing towards the goal. So I think it
well,
does
yeah.
answer my questions very well.
But also, you look at things like the Parliament of the World Religions, or Religions for Peace and so forth. So, um, there are examples of multi-religious organizations that are focusing on this kind of work as well.
Thank you so much for that answer. When we're talking about Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, we're still talking about monotheistic religious communities. Is
Uh,
there
yeah, go ahead.
interreligious regular dialogue with representatives of other religions, say with Hindus?
There, there, there is. I'm not directly involved in it. I'm not opposed to it. I just haven't had that opportunity. Get me the invitation and I'll be there. Um, uh, but yeah, I just there is certainly stuff, Jewish Buddhist dialogue. There is certainly Jewish Hindu dialogue. Um, and again, that multi-faith dialogue. That again, that hasn't been my primary focus, so I don't have a lot to say about it, but it's certainly there. And again, it depends on it depends on the context and the environment. Um, there is a Alan Brill, who's a scholar, American Jewish scholar, has written a lot about other types of interreligious dialogue.
Thank you so much. And It's good to know. It's good news that there is dialogue and it's developing, and it doesn't stay only within the Abrahamic religions.
Hmm. Hmm.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me that if we are talking about Abrahamic religions, then in the canonical texts of each of them, you can find a quote that can justify both good neighborly relations and hostility and hatred. You can
Yes.
even find a place in the Bible where it says, Ein Elohim, there is no God. Psalm 14, verse 1, and 53, verse 2. This is when the words are taken out of context. Does this mean that interreligious communication should be built not only on the Torah, the New Testament, or the Quran, but on the common values of each community in our times, for example, living in friendship and respecting one another?
Oh, absolutely. The sacred texts don't exist in isolation. They exist in communities, and each of those communities interprets those texts. And of course, when you interpret a text, you make a choice, right? And so um, you can either I like the Leviticus 19:18, right? You should love your neighbor as yourself. Now we can argue about what neighbor means, right? But um, um, you could put that verse on one side, and you could put another verse about idolaters on the other side, on the second side, and then decide, well, what's going to be your value? And we can see this kind of interpretation being used by those who either want to promote hostilities and violence, or those who want to promote understanding and peace. And so um, that's I think that these the choices that we make as interpreters becomes very important. And it really, I think some of it depends on what is our vision of the world in which we want to live. So clearly, I've made a decision on one side of that equation.
Yes. Well, um, we all have to decide on that. And for all the viewers, I just wanted to say that please check the sources. Sometimes things are taken out of context, and please check if the information is accurate. Uh, we can,
I'm going to say one of the projects that I was involved in was the Jewish Annotated New Testament, um, which is uh, it's the New Testament, but each book of the New Testament has a commentary by a Jewish scholar. And one of the things that this does is it highlights problematic texts, specifically texts that have been used as a sort of a source of anti-Judaism, and it offers contextual explanation for them and so forth. This kind of project of not just highlighting problematic texts in the New Testament, but also in our own tradition and so forth, and making people aware um, that there are other choices, that there are other options, I think is very important.
definitely, definitely, and I think that's a really great project, and it's great to hear that there are projects like that.
Hmm.
How can we ensure that interreligious dialogue does not become a kind of a new religion, but leads to reconsideration of religious teachings, rituals, and practices in order to eliminate any element of ridicule, disrespect, or dehumanizing the other?
Well, one of the primary sort of foundations of interreligious dialogue is um, respecting the integrity of the traditions with which one is in dialogue. That's the first thing. And the second thing is that um, uh, uh, one does not enter dialogue with the idea of converting the other person. Um, that just if that's the goal, then we don't have dialogue. Now, that doesn't mean that I don't, in dialogue, come in and represent myself as a Jewish person, or that my Christian neighbor doesn't come in and represent themselves as a Christian, as a faithful Christian. But the goal is not to convince the other person. The goal is to find the beauty in both our similarities and our differences. Um, uh, Sometimes interreligious dialogue tends to focus on only the similarities. And if we focus only on the similarities, then we really don't get to understand what makes the other, right? What, you know, similar, um, uh, it, Christer Stendahl, who was a Swedish Lutheran uh, bishop, I believe, also a great theologian of and practitioner of interreligious dialogue, talked about holy envy, the idea that um, I can see something beautiful and attractive and even spiritual in another tradition, and be moved by that, but understand that that doesn't belong to me. That belongs to the other tradition. And it's that I can only go so far and maintain my own integrity, but that doesn't mean that I can't see the wisdom or the beauty in somebody else's practice or belief. So I think interreligious dialogue is again based on the idea of maintaining the boundaries.
Yes, that's a great answer, and that is also what we discussed in the previous interviews, kind of what we kind of talked about a little bit is that you have to understand that you're not trying to convert a person and trying to hear the person. And that was one of the first uh problems of the dialogue, is that try everyone was trying not to talk about the problematic things and only talk about the things around them, only about the things we can definitely agree on. And it didn't really improve dialogue and understanding, maybe between the religions. I have one question which I normally conclude the interviews with.
Mhm.
If you had an opportunity to ask God one question, what would you ask the Creator?
Um, I would ask, why is it necessary for there to be hatred and violence in the world? That's what I would ask.
That's a great question. And yes, definitely, that's something we can even think about ourselves, and perhaps that will move us towards a more peaceful time. Dear David, thank you so much for your time and the great opportunity to learn from you.
Well, thank you. This sounds like a great project you're involved in.
Thank you so much. Dear friends, thank you for watching my channel. Please react to the podcast, like, share, comments. All reactions are welcome. We will add links to the project Rabbi Sandmel is involved in the comments. See you soon on the podcast, Keeping the Faith.